everybody. This is Dr. Ian Goldberg. He's the Chief Scientist of Zero Knowledge Systems, a Canadian privacy technology company. He was a founding member of UC Berkeley's Internet Security Applications, Authentication, and Cryptography Group. His research currently interests include cryptography, security, and privacy. Dr. Goldberg was known for his part in cracking the first RSA secret key challenge in only 3.5 hours, breaking Netscape's implementation of the encryption system SSL, and breaking the cryptography in the GSM cellular phone standard. Okay, and here's Dr. Ian Goldberg.
Thanks. So today I'm going to talk about something we call off-the-record messaging, subtitled, or when not to use PGP. This is joint work with Nikita Borisov and Eric Brewer of UC Berkeley, where I did my PhD. So a brief outline. First I'll introduce and motivate the problem. Talk a little about using PGP. I don't know how familiar people are in the audience with the details of public key cryptography signatures. I'll go over that at a really high level. There will be no actual math in this talk. If you want actual math, feel free to jump up and down and I'll spew some math at you and you'll go away confused. In general, at any time, if you have any questions, wave your arms around and I'll shoot you with my pointer, and once you get up, you can ask your question, and we'll just keep this pretty interactive. Then I'll go on to talk about the problems with PGP. Most people think PGP is great for sending these kinds of secure messages, and I'll point out why, where PGP falls a little short. And then towards a better solution, which we call off-the-record messaging, and I'll explain that more later. To get this better solution, we'll have to introduce some different cryptographic primitives above your basic public key encryption and signatures, and putting it together, and finally we'll conclude. So, introduction. Alice and Bob wish to have a secure private conversation. First, what do we mean? What do we mean by a secure private conversation? Alice and Bob are, of course, our two standard characters. We'll introduce some more standard characters later. What do most people mean when they say secure private conversation, especially in cryptographic context? Most people mean that no one other than Alice and Bob can read the messages sent between them. Also, that's what we mean by private. By secure, we mean that when Bob receives a message from Alice, he can be assured that Alice is in fact the one who sent it, and that it hasn't been modified in transit. Okay, so that's, and vice versa, of course, that when Alice sends a message, and when Alice receives a message from Bob, the similar things apply. So that's what most people mean if you just ask them in a cryptographic context, what do you mean by a secure private conversation? Now, how do they go about doing this? Well, Alice and Bob know a thing or two about cryptography. They've read Applied Crypto. So what do? They go get a copy of PGP or GNU-PG or whatever your favorite implementation of the RFC is, and they start exchanging messages. Okay, great. We'll even be a little bit generous and assume that they have some way of verifying each other's public keys. So this isn't the problem I'm talking about. I'm not talking about people impersonating public keys and man in the middle like this. I'm talking about more fundamental problems. So we're going to be generous and assume that Alice and Bob even have some secure method to validate each other's public keys. Okay? So off we go. Motivation. So PGP, in fact, satisfies the stated goal. So if you encrypt a message with PGP and send it off, then an eavesdropper can't read it, and if you digitally sign it, then Bob can be assured that Alice, in fact, sent this message and it hasn't been modified in transit. So what's the problem? Problem is the criteria we've listed for a secure private conversation don't really match what we intuitively mean. Right? This is what most people would answer if you ask them, what do you mean by secure private conversation, if they had to formalize it. But intuitively, it doesn't match. And why doesn't it match? Well, it turns out Alice and Bob are still vulnerable to attacks that shouldn't exist in a conversation that really is secure and private in some intuitive sense. And I'm going to formalize that a little more presently. So first I'll talk about PGP and how it works and a little bit about public key crypto. So quick review of public key concepts in PGP. Public key crypto is like a lockbox, has separate keys for locking and unlocking. Most people are probably familiar with this. Are there people here that have not seen public key crypto before? Great. So I can just go through this quickly. I'm not going to skip it entirely because some of the concepts are useful for analogies later on. So you're familiar, public key crypto is like a lockbox, has separate keys for locking and unlocking. I've seen really cool demonstrations of public key crypto where people actually have a physical lock with physical keys, one of which can lock it, one of which can unlock it, and then you can do all these cool protocols by having people at opposite ends of the stage passing boxes back and forth to each other, and unfortunately I don't have such cool hardware, so we'll have to pretend, use our imaginations. So the important concept is that you can't lock with the unlocking key and you can't unlock with the locking key. Clearly people knew how to build boxes like this for a long time, but we, and by we I mean the scientific community, I wasn't personally involved, figured out how to do this with mathematics instead of with metal in the 1970s. So we've known about this for a while now. Anyone can generate brand new pairs of locking and unlocking keys. This is an important property. So you can, out of thin air, create a pair of keys, one of which locks the box, one of which unlocks the box. But if you have only one of the keys, you can't derive the other one. Now this is a little bit stricter than you might think is necessary. You might think it could be okay if you have the unlocking key to be able to derive the locking key, or maybe the other way around. We're going to say, be a little stricter and say that if you have one of the keys, you can't derive the other one. And you'll see why in a bit. But you can see that it's equivalent to any formalism you might have in mind. And in PGP, at least newer versions of PGP, older versions of PGP like version 2 actually got this wrong and have some security weaknesses because of that, but that's not what I'm talking about here. In PGP, the user makes two key pairs, one key pair for encrypting messages and one key pair for signing messages. Okay, and older versions of PGP use the same key pair for both, and that actually has security weaknesses involved with it. So, public key encryption. Public key encryption Bob's setup is he makes a key pair, known as the encryption key pair. He widely publishes copies of the encryption locking key and keeps the unlocking key to himself, just what you'd expect. Now Alice wants to send a message to Bob. What she does is looks up a copy of Bob's locking key, which is widely published, used it to lock her message, sends the message to Bob over a public channel. Eve is our eavesdropper, another of our standard characters. Eve wants to read Alice's messages to Bob. Eve can get hold of Bob's locking key just like anyone else can, but not his unlocking key, because only Bob has that and he doesn't give it out. At least that's the idea. So Eve can't read the message. In fact, not even Alice can read the message she has locked to Bob if she didn't keep a copy of it. If she locks it and forgets what she wrote, she's just as out of luck as Eve is. However, Bob can clearly read the message. He has the unlocking key. He just unlocks it. Okay, digital signatures. This is similar but slightly different. Alice has the setup this time. She makes a key pair, the signature key pair. And this time she widely publishes the unlocking key and keeps the locking key for herself. This is why we don't want to say you can always derive the unlocking key, the locking key from the unlocking key, or vice versa, because it makes more sense to talk about signatures in the sense that the unlocking key is the public one and the locking key is the secret one. And why? Well, Alice sends a message to Bob, and in order to sign the message, what she really does is takes the message and locks it using her signature locking key. And then when anyone receives that message, they can check that Alice was the one that locked it by using Alice's unlocking key and seeing if it opens the box. And if it opens the box, then they know that Alice must have been the one that locked the box, because only Alice's locking key is able to lock a box that Alice's unlocking key can open. Okay? So anyone can check that. Also, an additional property is no one could have modified the message. Here the box analogy breaks down a little. You can think of it as if anyone takes this locked box and pounds it with a hammer, then the unlocking key will jam and not break or something. Okay, the analogy is a little stretched, but the idea is that the unlocking key will only be successful. Bob and anyone else will only be able to unlock the message if the locked box is intact. Okay, so Bob has a guarantee that Alice is in fact the one that signed the message and that it hasn't been modified in transit. Okay, and then just putting it together, in PGP you generally do both. You encrypt and sign, and the way that works is Alice takes the message, locks it once with her own signature key, then takes that, sticks it in another box, and locks that with Bob's encryption key. Okay, so she locks it with her locking key, her signature locking key, which is private, she's the only one with that, and locks it again with Bob's encryption locking key, which is public, everyone has that, and sends that over the wire. Eve, who might intercept this message, can't unlock the box, right? Because only Bob, with his unlocking key, can unlock this outer box. And this is important. You might imagine a few different ways you could combine Alice's signature key and Bob's encryption key. You could imagine you take the message and do this. You first sign it and then encrypt it. Or you can imagine you first encrypt it and then sign it. Or there are some cases where you can do kind of both at the same time. And these three scenarios have different security properties, and in different circumstances you might want to do different ones of them. The reason PGP does it this way, there are a few reasons. One of them is that if you do it the other way, where first you encrypt it and then you sign it, then anyone, even Eve, who can't, even if they can't read the message, can verify that Alice was the one that sent it, right? And that's often something you might not want. And similarly, if you take one box and put two locks on it that encrypts it and signs it, you also have this property. So PGP does it this way, which for most applications of secure messaging is the correct thing to do. So this isn't the problem I'm getting to. And Bob does in fact get these guarantees. So what's the problem? People use this all the time, right? People use PGP. How many people here use PGP? Yeah, that's about what I expect, about half. And you thought you were secure. Okay, so the one sentence bit to take away from this talk is that PGP works really well when nothing goes wrong, but things go wrong. Okay? So what happens if Bob's computer is owned by Carl the Cracker? Right? So Bob's running Windows. Okay? He gets the latest and greatest email worm virus thing. He downloads something off a peer-to-peer system and runs it, or fancy new screensaver with Snow White and however many whatevers, and you've probably gotten all of these emails. So Carl breaks into Bob's computer. Carl can recover Bob's encryption unlocking key. Okay, this is bad, right? The problem is, this is really hard to prevent, right? A lot of this conference is about trying to prevent it. But the other half of the equation is mitigating the badness that can happen once Carl does get in, right? We know we can't perfectly lock out the bad guys, right? So what we want to do is be able to do damage control. We want to keep the amount of mischief that Carl can engage in to a minimum, okay? And this is where PGP falls short. With PGP, basically, what can Carl do? Well, if Bob doesn't realize, there are two cases. If Bob doesn't realize that Carl has owned his computer, then Carl will certainly be able to read all communication from Alice to Bob, right? He just has Bob's unlocking key. Every time Alice sends Bob a message, Carl can copy it and read it. No problem. If Bob does realize it, he can go, okay, and publish a revocation and change his key pair. Yep? That's right. So the comment was, if Carl owns Bob's computer, he doesn't even need to read the encrypted message. He can just watch Bob reading it. It's decrypted in the RAM of Bob's computer. But if he takes the key, then even if Bob locks him out, but he doesn't, or if he has temporary access to Bob's computer, right, like he walks into Bob's office, copies his disk, and walks out, right? Even in a scenario like that, where the cracker only has temporary access to Bob's computer, he can still read all future messages until Bob changes his key pair. So there's a lot of badness that can happen. We want to limit how much badness this is. Worse, even if Bob changes his encryption key pair, we have this problem that Carl can read all of Bob's past messages, right? So if Carl is, say, recording all of the information going to Bob, he can't read it. He just records it because he's part of Carnivore or something, right? So he just has this big log of all the encrypted bits going to Bob. A year from now, Bob's key is exposed. Carl breaks into it, it's subpoenaed, whatever. Somehow Bob's decryption key is exposed a year from now. Retroactively, all that email becomes insecure.
Are we keeping out the good guys or bad guys?
Bob wants to keep out everyone, right? So from the mathematical point of view, there's no difference between good guys and bad guys. Alrighty then. The other badness that Carl can do is unlock the outer box to get the inner signed message and just prove to other people that Alice had written these messages to Bob. Okay, so what's that? I'm just saying he's gotten his decryption key, not his signature key, just yet. Yeah?
This is all assuming that Bob's key isn't in the plain text. It's not.
This is assuming that Carl has somehow recovered the decryption key. If, like in the case of PGP, the decryption, the key stored on disk is actually an encrypted form of the decryption key with the passphrase. If Carl can break into Bob's computer, he can put a keystroke logger or whatever and grab the passphrase. I'm assuming if someone owns your computer, you're toast, right? Any secrets that you know and that you type into the computer or that are stored on the computer are now compromised. And I mean, just ask Scarfo, right? Right, this is not something I'm hypothesizing. This is known technology, so. Okay, so just in summary, this is a really bad one, right? That I'm sending you encrypted messages. I know my machine is secure right now. A year goes by, something changes in my firewall setup, my machine is cracked. Now, retroactively, all my messages are compromised. Okay? This is something we really want to avoid. So, here are two properties PGP doesn't provide that we really want in a conversation that we're going to call secure and private. One is perfect forward secrecy. How many people know about perfect forward secrecy? Okay, some. So, perfect forward secrecy is the assurance that once Bob has received Alice's message and destroyed his copy. Okay, so Alice sends a message to Bob, Bob reads it, Bob burns it, right? It should now be impossible for anyone on the planet, including Alice, Bob, Eve, Carl, anyone, to decrypt it later on, right? Even if all of Alice and Bob's secrets become compromised. This is the super strong property we want, right? That PGP, as we've seen, does not provide. So even if all data going from Alice to Bob has been recorded, all the encrypted data, and later on, all of Alice and Bob's secrets are compromised, that encrypted data is not decryptable. Okay? So, I'll talk about how you do that in a bit, but this is just what we mean by perfect forward secrecy. Yeah?
Is the data analog something like PGP phone?
So the question is, isn't this just the data analog of PGP phone? I believe PGP phone does incorporate perfect forward secrecy, in fact. I don't know the protocol off the top of my head, but I would be hard-pressed to design a encrypted voice over IP system that did not have this property. What's that? Using temporary encryption keys and things like that, yeah. Yeah?
As a designer of the client to enable this type of functionality rather than having it sit within PGP itself. Because PGP is just essentially a tool that we added to user interface for messaging like email. So it should be up to the implementation in the client itself rather than up to PGP itself.
It turns out it's not. You would hope that's the case. It turns out that the way the protocol, the way the message format is written precludes you from doing this. There are proposed extensions to the OpenPGP format RFC to enable this, and hopefully they'll go through, certainly.
Time limitation on data that's been encrypted, that you would be able to say this data will be decrypted for this piece of time and have.
Well, you can't really do that. There are lots of people who really want to do things like time lock cryptography and reverse time lock like that, where you say you want some way to say this encrypted data can only be decrypted between this time and this time in the future, right? Turns out that's a really hard thing to do. In order to make sure it's not decryptable until a certain point, the best protocols so far involve things like don't tell anyone the key and force them to brute force it, and just make it hard enough to brute force that it'll take this long, right? So the way to make it undecryptable after a certain date, after a certain specific time, often involves things like trusted time servers and things like that. But I don't know of any protocol like that that has a high degree of security. If you have a trusted third party, you can do things like that. Then your trusted third party can always read the message, though. You have to trust them, hence the name. Well, depends how you implement it. If the trusted third party is only there to provide clock service, then yeah, you can spoof it. If the way the protocol works is I hand the clear text message to the trusted third party, and to decrypt it, you ask the trusted third party for it, and the trusted third party, if it's in the right time, tells it to you, and if it's not, he says no, right? Right? That's a very simple protocol involving a trusted third party for this. But we want to avoid trusted third parties because it turns out they're not all that trustworthy most of the time. Funny that. Okay, the other property we really want for a secure private conversation is called repudiability. And this is the ability for Alice to deny that she wrote any particular message. Okay? Now, this is a little different from what most people know if they learn cryptography from something like applied crypto or on the net, right? Most of the time when you learn about cryptography, it's pounded into you really want non-repudiability. Non-repudiability is good, right? So that's why we have digital signatures. It's great for electronic contracts where you don't want people to get out of what they wrote. It's not good for private communication, right? If I'm having a secret discussion with you, I don't want a proof signed by me of that discussion, right? That really is the opposite of what we want here. So we want repudiability, not non-repudiability. You might think that Alice could just get repudiability simply by using PGP and not signing the message, right? Problem is then, Bob isn't even assured of the authenticity of the message, and it's no longer secure. Then the message is forgeable, and you lose the security properties.
But isn't any extension of PGP that has perfect core security secrecy going to have the attribute that they were repudiable?
No, not necessarily. Those are two separate things. You could still have your standard signature block on a message, and the encryption envelope is done with forward secrecy.
Sign the message with the same protocol that you're using to attain forward secrecy.
So it turns out that's a little bit hard. You can do it right. I'm not sure if the various proposals going forward now provide repudiability or not. Let me think about it a little more. I'd have to read them again. I can't answer that question right now. But it's not necessarily the case that it would do it, but it's certainly true that without much more work, you can achieve it. And in fact, I'm going to show you how to do that. So, yeah.
Achieving repudiability and somehow confirming authenticity of paradox. I mean, if we can confirm authenticity, then it's about.
Why, yes, and I'll get to that just in a bit. It's not quite the question was, isn't repudiability and confirming the authenticity of a message a paradox? And the answer is, it's not quite a paradox, and there's a loophole that we're going to escape through. But I'll get to that in just a few slides. Yeah.
Alice wants to be able to deny she wrote the message to anybody other than Bob, or?
So, as I said, I'll get to this in a bit. Bob wants to be assured that Alice wrote the message. Alice wants to be able to deny that she wrote the message to later on. Yeah, and all this fudging of words is, you'll see where the loophole is. What's that? To everyone, including Bob. Yeah. Okay?
Another area where mathematics has no ethics.
Was there another question? Yeah.
Yeah, one of the questions, you can take this offline if you want, but I've always argued that on repeatability, you're really not saying that Alice signed the message or anything, you're really saying Alice's computer signed the message.
Always a good point, and always Alice can take any non-repudiable system and say, well, I didn't sign it, my computer signed it, and someone broke into it. Alice now has a larger burden of proof, as it were, a larger hurdle to claim that she didn't write it. Because now she has to claim that someone in fact broke into her computer and stole her secrets. In a truly reputable system, it's that anyone in the world could have written this message without knowing any secrets that Alice holds.
So when does this matter given?
Okay. So, we have what we're going to call off-the-record messaging. And the idea is that two people have an off-the-record conversation, right? Someone's whistleblowing to a reporter or whatever, and wants no record that this conversation ever took place. It certainly should not be the case that a day or a week later the conversation is decryptable by anyone. It should certainly not be the case that there is some signed proof that this conversation took place. Once the conversation is over, it's gone. It's just any possible record of the conversation should have been turned into random bits that are no longer recoverable. Okay? So, in particular, some properties we want. If no one was actively listening in at the time the conversation took place, and the reason we have to have this disclaimer is that if Carl has owned Bob's computer while he's communicating with Alice, clearly he can read the message, right? There's nothing we can do about that.
Can you be sure Alice and Bob wrote the message at the time the message was being sent?
The question is, can he be sure if Carl owns Alice's box,
Can he be sure Bob sent the message?
can he be sure Bob sent the message? And if Alice can be sure, then he can be sure. Right? So, but if no one was actively listening in at the time the conversation was taking place, then the conversation's contents are secure forever. Then we have another caveat that what if Alice or Bob is a snitch and intentionally reveals the conversation? Turns out we're going to deal with this case as well. We want to prevent, even if Bob is a snitch, we want to make as little badness as possible happen. And we'll see how little we can make that about this. And we'll talk about this right now. So even if Bob goes to some third party Trent with the contents of the conversation, we want it to be the case that even though Bob was assured that Alice had written the message, if Bob shows the message to Trent, Trent is not so assured. Trent has to take Bob's word for it. Bob could have made up this whole conversation out of whole cloth. Right?
Where Bob videotapes the entire process. Where he's only going to see indication on his screen that this message truly came from Alice. So that's what he's going to take individually. And that's his assurance. If I'm recording the entire process, then I can play that back to somebody else.
But Bob could have modified his software, right? Bob could have modified his software to put up any screens he wants and videotapes it.
Somebody else could have modified what's coming up on his computer as well.
Oh, absolutely. But if no one has compromised Bob's computer, which is this caveat here, then Bob is actually assured that the conversation is secure.
Provided that nobody is also...
No, even if Bob's a snitch, he is still assured the conversation is secure.
Technology exists, we need to be actively cooperating with Trent in such a way that Trent can be assured that Alice was the one who wrote the message.
At the end of the day, Trent has to trust that Bob has cooperated in the way he's supposed to cooperate. Right? The point is that Alice, from a protocol point of view, can deny anything, and Bob could have written any message that he shows to Trent. Right, so Trent can't be assured that Alice's messages are authentic. We want that to be the case. However, Bob needs to be assured that Alice's messages are authentic. And this is this apparent paradox, right? So in order to achieve these goals, and in particular the last two, which really look conflicting at first glance, we're going to need to use cryptographic techniques a little more esoteric than plain public key encryption and signatures. And all of you have seen public key encryption and signatures before. Not all of you may have seen some of these other things. So, first one, I've already mentioned, perfect forward secrecy. This is ensuring that key compromise can't be used to recover past messages. The second technique we're going to use is called message authentication codes. This allows Alice and Bob to be assured of the authenticity of each other's messages without Trent being able to be so assured. And the third thing is malleable encryption. And this allows anyone to easily modify transcripts of encrypted conversations, and this further aids Alice's repudiability. Okay, so I'll talk about each of these in turn in quite a bit of detail. Okay, first, perfect forward secrecy. So Carl has compromised either Alice's or Bob's computer. If he does this at the time a message is being composed and sent or received and read, he can clearly read the message, right? Nothing we can do can prevent this from happening.
But if the encryption is malleable, he doesn't really know that Alice wrote the message
the question was, if the encryption is malleable, which I haven't actually talked about yet, but in a repudiable system, the question is, he's not assured that Alice was in fact the one who sent it. And the answer is, if Bob is so assured, then Alice is so assured. If Bob is so assured, then Carl is so assured. Because the thing, as we'll see in a bit, the thing that makes the repudiability work is that Bob can cheat, right? If Carl's just watching what Bob's doing, he can tell that Bob's not cheating, right? And if he's watching at the time, he can tell that Bob's not cheating, and he's assured that Alice is in fact the one who wrote the message. If Carl wasn't watching at the time, and Bob just shows him or Trent a copy of the message, Bob could have cheated. And we'll talk in a bit about how this cheating happens.
Is this true even if Carl records stateful accession information, everything that happens inside the encryption process?
Yeah. The question is this true even if Carl records all state that happens inside the encryption and decryption process? And the answer is yes. The problem is that Bob is going to be able to create identical messages to the ones Alice created. Okay. So, if Carl has compromised a computer, then any messages going through at that time clearly are compromised. Nothing we can do there. But once the compromise is detected and corrected, so once Carl is locked out again and Bob changes his keys, future messages should not be exposed. Alice and Bob should be able to resume communication, and Carl should not be able to read them. This means in particular that encryption key material has to be generated freshly and not derived from some stored state. So this is basically saying change your encryption keys often, right? But it's a little more subtle than that. You can't just do things like add 1 to your old encryption key to get your new encryption key, or hash your old encryption key to get your new encryption key. And you shouldn't laugh, there are protocols in existence out there that do exactly that. They change encryption keys simply by hashing your old one. They do it for a different reason. The reason they do it is often if you have a lot of traffic encrypted under one key, then that can help you encrypt analysis. So what the system does is, not assuming that someone has cracked the system and recovered today's key, but rather they just hash the key every day so that there's a limited amount of material ever encrypted under one encryption key, right? But a system like that, even though it does change the keys regularly, does not satisfy this property, because if Carl breaks in and gets today's key, he automatically knows all keys for the future. In addition, a compromise must never expose past messages, right? So if you're simply adding 1 to the encryption key every day, then if I break in today, I also know all past encryption keys, and that's even worse. So in order to get perfect forward secrecy, we require that if Carl breaks in and then is locked out again, he's allowed to be able to read any messages that are sent or received during that time that he was in the computer, but nothing before that and nothing after that. So that's the definition of perfect forward secrecy. So how do we do this? First thing we do is pour some more water. Okay, so we derive some properties that are logical consequences of our definition of perfect forward secrecy. If a compromise must not expose the contents of past messages, then it has to be the case that the encryption keys to those past messages not only aren't in the box anymore, but can't even be calculated from any information in the box, right? So any encryption key for last week's messages is gone, right? It's not only not stored in the box, it's not on the hard disk, it's not in your swap file, right? It's not even derivable from any material there. Okay, so that's an important property. In particular, you need to frequently change the keys. How frequently? As frequently as possible is the short glib answer. In practice, changing keys has a cost, and you have to balance that cost against what you're doing, what you're securing. Security is economics. I mean, this is pretty standard argument. It turns out it's not very expensive. I'll talk a little more about the cost of changing keys in a minute. But it turns out it's often not unreasonable to use a different encryption key pair for every message that you send. Yeah?
Does that involve past messages if you have to notice? Like once the keys are lost, you can't read them yourself, right?
That's correct. Yep. And if you think of an instant message setting or something like that, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And especially if you think about the kinds of conversations we're talking about, that's an extremely reasonable thing to want to happen, right? Yeah? How do you validate? The question is, if you're always changing keys, how do you validate them? And I'll talk about that in just a bit.
And how can Alice trust Bob if you actually change the keys or actually lose them, like waste it?
The question is, how can Alice trust that Bob is actually forgetting his old keys? And the answer to that is that Alice can't necessarily trust Bob, but that just reduces to the case that Bob is a snitch and is voluntarily breaking the protocol in order to reveal more information, which we deal with separately. Okay? Right. And as I mentioned earlier, the keys need to have a large, fresh random component, each key, right? You can't just take the hash of the current time and some master secret to get a key, because then past and or future keys will be derivable from state that's currently on the box. So to make a key, you pick some randomness out of your favorite real random number generator, like you have a radioactive source plugged into your computer, right? Everyone has one of those? No? Oh well. We'll get one soon. Intel motherboards have one of those, right? It's not radioactive. But. So you get real randomness, you use that as the key, or combine that with something, use that as the key. And once you very well scrub and erase that memory, it's no longer recoverable by any means. So that's really what you want. Okay, the costs of perfect forward secrecy. How expensive is it to change keys? The answer, as always, is it depends. If you're using something like RSA for your encryption mechanism, key pair generation is pretty expensive. On a modern processor, it takes several seconds, which means on an old PDA, it will take quite a while, several minutes. Depending on your application, if your application is real-time video, that's not going to work, right? If your application is send the launch codes once and you send these messages only once a month or so, right, then it's okay to take several minutes to do this. So as always, it depends on your application. On the other hand, if you're using an encryption mechanism like Elgamal or Diffie-Hellman, turns out it's really cheap to generate a key pair. It's one modular exponentiation, which is about 0.1 seconds on a modern processor. It's still several seconds on an old PDA, so you might not be able to do it every message if messages are going faster than that. But even in an instant message-like application, one message every few seconds is pushing the bounds of reasonable. So you might not want to change the key every single message, but maybe every 5 or 10 messages or something like this.
Are there any advantages using Elgamal, or actually not advantages, using Elgamal or Diffie-Hellman or RSA?
Not really. I almost always find it preferable to use Elgamal and Diffie-Hellman. There are some other technical advantages, like RSA encryption is cheaper than Elgamal encryption, because you only have to do basically a couple of modular multiplications to do cubing mod a number, right? An RSA encryption is just raising to this tiny exponent 3 or 65537 or something really small, whereas Elgamal encryption involves raising to a much larger exponent. There's a question here? No? Okay. So there are trade-offs between whether encryption and or decryption speed is important to you and whether key generation time is important to you. So as always, you have to look at your application. Okay, what else? There's also the cost of distributing the new keys, right? So if you remember, your public encryption key, everyone's supposed to have a copy of, right? So what, now, once a second you're publishing a new key? That's not going to work really well. Not to mention that the MIT key server is going to get full real fast, right? So that's another thing to take into account. And you also might have to keep track of some old ones in order to read a message. Say a message takes a long time in transit, right? You might want to read it, but okay, so the two things. Distributing new keys is straightforward. Basically, anytime I send you a message, I attach to it a copy of my current encryption key, the key you should use to send me the next message you send me. And if I send you a different message and I've changed my key, I'll send you a different public key. But let's say you sent me a message and I've changed my key and I'm sending you my new key and they cross. I need to have that old key lying around in order to read it. You can't keep old keys too long though, for obvious reasons, right? Because if you keep an old key too long, then a compromise will expose all the messages encrypted with those old keys. So there's a trade-off. Turns out that just keeping the current key and the previous key is usually enough. That will handle messages crossing in transit. And if you change your keys with a certain pattern, which I'll talk about in a bit, then unless you have major message reordering, which doesn't happen that often, you're okay.
This means that the second I have the current key, I have subsequent keys that won't go.
How's that?
I'm eavesdropping in the middle. The second I have the current key, if I attach the new, if Alice and Bob attach the new key each time to the next message, then I will be able to decrypt the next key each time.
So the question is, But that means that as soon as I get the current key, then when Bob sends his next key with his next message, you'll be able to read it. And that's not quite right, because Bob doesn't send his private key, he sends his public key. If you have Bob's current private key, then the next message that goes by, he's sending his new public key, and in a couple of seconds he's going to forget his old private key. So now you know no secret information of Bob's, but you know his new public key. But that's okay, everyone's allowed to know the public key. The question is, isn't this method vulnerable to denial of service? And the answer is, it's exactly as vulnerable as the communication itself, right? If
I miss a message, then I won't know the user public key again. It's like chain block encryption.
So the point is, if you miss a message, you won't know the future public key. And in a moment, you'll see how we get around that. We assume that messages might be droppable. Yeah.
So whatever publishing entity you have that holds the repository of your public keys, every time somebody here requests a public key, they're going to have to generate a new key pair and somehow get that private key back to you. If I have 5 people that all want to send me a message while my system is offline, then at some point I'm going to have to receive the new secret key that correspond to those public keys. How do I use that?
Okay, so the question is, the repository that stores everyone's public keys basically has a problem, right? The short answer is, we basically do away with the repository storing the encryption keys. And you'll see how. You'll see how in just a minute. I think I'll finish answering that question after I show you how changing your keys works. So, basically, these are the steps you use for updating your keys. For every person you're actively communicating with, and by actively I mean something like you're in an instant message chat and you're having an active conversation. Once you're done and you stop talking to him, you can forget all your keys, and if you want to start talking with him again, you restart the protocol. Okay? So for everyone you're having an active conversation with, and this is the same, if you're familiar with cryptography, just think of this as what you would ordinarily use a session key for, right? Instead of storing just a session key, this is what you store. You store his current encryption key for you, his public key, your current key pair for him, and your previous key pair for him. And you'll note here that what I mean by his key for you is that for every person you're communicating with, you keep a separate encryption key pair. This is why we don't have a repository of encryption key pairs anymore, because there is not one public key that you use. If there was, then if that was compromised, it would reveal a lot of information. So anyone that wants to communicate with you has to contact you, and this is the startup phase, contacts you and gets your current public key for him, which you will generate on the fly. Okay? So whenever you send a message, you use your current idea of his encryption locking key to lock it, and you include a copy of your current locking key so he knows how to respond. When you receive a message, then it's either a message encrypted with a really old key, in which case, oh well, you can't read it at all. Or it's encrypted with your previous key, or it's encrypted with your current key. If it's encrypted with your current key, that means, obviously, that the guy that sent you the message knows your current key, which means you don't care about your previous key anymore, because he's already on your current key. So that's the point at which you make a new key. So anytime you receive a message that shows that the guy you're communicating with has received and is now using your current key, that's when you make a new key. If you never send him a message, so if you have an unbalanced communication where one person's sending a lot and this guy sends rarely, then the same key does get used a lot. You can slightly mitigate this by, if your application does have this feature of a lot of messages tend to be sent this way, then just send acknowledgements occasionally that cause the keys to change. Okay, and when you receive a message, you can just read this. You forget your old key pair, you change your current key pair to your old key pair, and you make a new current key pair. And his message will include his current encryption key, which might be different from the last idea you knew from him. It might have changed in the meantime, and just store that as here, what your idea of his encryption key is. Yeah?
What's the advantage of this over simply deleting messages that
The question is, what's the advantage of this over simply deleting messages? The problem is, you don't know that even Carl have deleted the messages. If Carnivore has been recording all of the messages that have been going to you, they'll keep it for years, right? And you have no way to delete that information. So you need to delete all copies of the keys so that any copies of the encrypted messages are useless. Yeah?
With this method of rekeying, you have to, I'm assuming you have to supply a different way of authenticating the two to each other.
I'll get to authentication in a bit. Is there a question out there? Okay. So, one more detail. This is technical cryptographic detail. The usual thing that you do in public key cryptography, we do here too. You don't actually take the message and encrypt it with public key cryptography. You, by encrypt with the current locking key, we really mean use Diffie-Hellman to combine your and his encryption keys to produce a shared secret. If you're not familiar with Diffie-Hellman, it's basically a way to take two people's public keys and combine them in a way that if you know either of the private keys, you can determine a certain value, which will be the same regardless of which private key you know. But if you know neither of the private keys, then you can't determine that value. Okay? So that's a really cool cryptographic technique, and this forms one of the really cool ways to do perfect forward secrecy. So you produce a shared secret that way. And then you use that shared secret to encrypt the message using a regular symmetric cipher like AES. Right? And the reason you do that is that public key crypto is slow and AES is fast. So for a big message, it's easier to use public key crypto only to generate one small number and then use that to encrypt a large message.
Are you using a particular variation of Diffie-Hellman? Does this work with RSA?
As long as you can derive a shared secret, it should work fine. You have to be careful with RSA because you have to somehow still get the perfect forward secrecy aspect. So if you're using RSA, you have to change your RSA keys a lot. It's still doable. That's not how we chose to implement it. But if you're... Yeah, if you change your RSA keys sufficiently often, then you can get perfect forward secrecy that way. So the question is, can you expand this to more than a two-party communication? The easiest way to do that is by doing an obvious extension of this to do that is by just having a flood algorithm with a tree structure. Use a minimum spanning tree and a flood algorithm, and each hop is encrypted just with two-party communication. There are variants of Diffie-Hellman that work with multiple keys, and you could do it that way as well. Okay, and the other benefit is the resulting shared secret changes every time either party changes his encryption key. And this will be really useful to us later. Okay. So, now we move on to the next piece, message integrity. So we're moving away from confidentiality, which is achieved by perfect forward secrecy, onto integrity.
Regarding the exchange of keys, what happens if Carl tries to manage a little attack? He knows one key, and he makes sure that Bob doesn't receive confirmation that if you're using a new key, you're using really the old key. If he's using only the old key and he's going to destroy the old key and start the new.
So the question is, what if Carl performs an attack where he knows Bob's current key and he somehow prevents Bob from realizing that Alice knows his current key and thus Bob never changes his key? The only way for Bob to not know that Alice knows his current key is if Bob never receives any messages from Alice. So it becomes simply a denial of service attack, and if Bob never receives any messages from Alice, then the fact that Carl knows his decryption key is useless, because there's no messages to decrypt. Carl wouldn't be able to make Alice's messages look like the old key, right? Alice would only be encrypting messages to the old key if she never received any messages from Bob, right? Because every one of Bob's messages would contain his new key. Okay, message integrity. So we want to arrange the following situation. Bob receives a message purportedly from Alice. Bob needs to be assured that the message actually came from Alice and hasn't been modified. Same setup as for digital signatures. But no one, not even Bob, can assure anyone else of this fact. Okay? If anyone tries to check whether Alice sent this message, they have no idea. If Bob tries to show someone, I got this message from Alice, they have no reason to believe him. Right? He could have just made up that message himself, which is not the case with digital signatures. If the message is digitally signed, then anyone can check that the message was in fact sent by Alice. So we need to do something different. How do we arrange this? So here's the main useful observation. We arrange that the messages are cryptographically authenticated using a key known to both Alice and Bob. Right? A digital signature is authenticated using a key known only to Alice. So if the authentication checks out, then Alice must have been the one that sent it. If we change the situation that it's authenticated using a key known to both Alice and Bob, and no one else, then Bob knows that since he didn't write the message, Alice must have. But anyone else doesn't know that Bob didn't write the message. Bob could have written the message. So if Bob shows the message to anyone else, he could have written it. Right? This is the cute trick. This is called a message authentication code, or MAC. And I think it's cooler than digital signatures, but certainly much less widely deployed.
As far as issues though, as far as scalability, you have to share 100 secrets with 100 different people.
So it's a linear increase, a constant factor increase over already sharing a session key with multiple people. In fact, you don't have to, no, it's no increase, right? As if you're already storing session keys with multiple people you're communicating with, then this MAC key can just be, in fact, I'll talk about that next slide, can just be derived from that session key. So, yeah, here. So, a MAC is to a public key digital signature what a symmetric encryption is to public key encryption, right? And the reason I say that is a MAC uses the same key to authenticate and to verify the signature, whereas a digital signature uses a different key to authenticate and verify. In the same way that a symmetric encryption uses the same key to encrypt and decrypt, and public key encryption uses a different key to encrypt and decrypt. Okay, so the way a MAC works is Alice and Bob share a MAC key. There's some shared key. This isn't the same as the shared encryption key. Just like you don't want to use the same key for public key encryption and digital signatures, you don't want to use the same key for encryption and for symmetric encryption and macking, but it can be related. It can be a related key. And we'll see how to relate it later. This key is used both for creating the authenticator, which is called the tag, as well as for checking it. So the way that you do a MAC is you have a message, you know a key, you use the key and the message and you hash it together and you get some authenticator called the tag. To check it, basically Bob, when he receives the message and the tag, he just takes the same key, the same message, creates the tag and checks that the tag's the same. Right? Straightforward. But no one except Alice and Bob can forge authentic looking messages. Right? Because no one else knows that key. So if anyone else tries to create a tag, Bob, when he creates his copy of the tag, it won't match. In fact, no one else can even check that a message is authentic, because you need to know the key in order to check it. Okay, repudiability. This is how we handle snitches. So if Bob is a snitch, certainly he can tell everything he knows to Trent, right? So we can't prevent the information from getting out. What we can prevent is Trent having any assurance that that information is accurate, right? We want to make it the case that Trent has to trust that Bob is doing the right thing, right? If Bob's cooperating with the FBI, well, there's only so much Alice can do, right? But we want there not to be some proof that Alice wrote this message. Yeah.
Carl owns Bob's computer, and Bob doesn't know Alice wrote the message. Carl might have written the message.
If Carl's owning Bob's computer at the time, then, as we said before, all bets are off during that time, right? We want to, well, that's not actually true. If Carl owns Bob's computer, he can't make a message look like it came from Alice. Oh yes, no, you're right. But yeah, anything that happens while Bob's computer is compromised, we can't prevent, right? Okay. So the method of using a MAC prevents Bob from convincingly snitching on Alice, right? Because any transcript that he might show to Trent, he could have made up completely. What about Carl? Let's say Carl steals Bob's keys and records a transcript of the encrypted conversation, right? Surely he can read the communication. He has the keys, he has the encrypted data, he can read it. Nothing we can do about that. We can still try to prevent him from being able to show the transcript to Trent and being able to prove anything about it. Okay? So we use the same trick as before. Now we want to make sure that it's extremely clear that Carl knows the MAC key. Right? Because if Carl knows the MAC key, then Trent has to trust that Carl didn't completely forge this transcript. If Carl didn't know the MAC key, then there would be this hurdle of logic that would have to be made. So what we do is we calculate the MAC key. Remember, I said it shouldn't be the same as the encryption key, but it can be related. We calculate the MAC by taking a simple one-way hash function of the encryption key. So we derive the encryption key using Diffie-Hellman, using this mathematical way of combining the public encryption keys to get the shared secret. The shared secret we use as the AES encryption key. Then we hash that and use that as the MAC key. And the result is that anyone that can read a message can automatically forge the message. Okay, so if you can read it in any way, if no matter how you got your hands on the encryption key, which is the same as the decryption key, you can automatically forge the message. So anyone that hands you a transcript of the message, of the conversation, could have forged it. Yeah?
How are the initial different elements communicated as far as knowing you're working with if you're Bob and you're working with Alice?
So that's the...
Because it sounds like it starts with the Diffie Hellman exchange.
Yeah.
You get the shared secret, and then you use that to come up with the pack. So if you trace that back.
Right, so the first message that's exchanged is basically the original public keys, and there I use the fact that Alice and Bob, remember way back in the beginning I said we're going to grant that Alice and Bob have some way to authenticate each other's keys, and you verify a signature key pair on the phone, and then you can sign that the original Diffie-Hellman communication, just with your normal signed Diffie-Hellman. And that doesn't break any of the repudiability properties because the information that is signed strictly consists of a key, a public key, and no data.
Then why do you even need the MAC? So if you're using Diffie-Hellman, you trust who you're talking to based on Diffie-Hellman.
Well, because the signature is only on the first message, so then if the adversary changes subsequent messages, you still want to be able to detect that fact. Yeah.
Then there may be scenarios where you have to have a single public key out there that cannot change for the initiation of conversations if you have no other method of giving out names.
Right, so the point is you might have to have a single public key out there that does not change, and that's correct, but that's a signature key and not an encryption key. No information is protected by that key, and if a signature key becomes compromised, then changing it has no adverse effect on past communication, which is very important. And we have to speed along a little here, so I can take that up a little later. Okay, so again, we just make the MAC key a hash of the encryption key, so anyone that can read the conversation can forge it. So what about Eve? Eve doesn't break into anybody's computer. Eve is just carnivore, can just record a lot of data. So Eve records a transcript of the conversation, but can't necessarily read it. Okay? Most cryptosystems are what's called non-malleable. This is another one of the things that you read Applied Crypto, you really want when you design a cryptosystem, non-malleability. What non-malleability means is you want it to be hard to take an encrypted message that you don't have the key to and modify it in such a way that the decryption still makes sense. Right? And most cryptosystems have something like this property. But if Eve captures a transcript in a non-malleable system, so that if she doesn't know the key, she can't modify it so that decrypting it makes any sense. If Carl separately comes up with the decryption key, then it's pretty clear that if that decryption key decrypts the transcript to something sensible, then that transcript must be accurate, because Eve couldn't have modified it, right? So we need it to be the case that Eve can alter a transcript even if she doesn't know Bob's secrets. Okay? She has to be able to take a transcript and modify it so that the decryption is still makes sense, but is not in fact what Alice said, even if she knows no secrets at all. How do we do that? We use what's called malleable encryption, the opposite of non-malleable. We want to make it as easy as possible for Eve to sensibly alter the transcripts, even if she can't decrypt them. The easiest way to do this is just use any of the XOR styles of encryption. You can either take a block cipher and use a mode like OFB or CTR. CTR is my new favorite mode. It's just so cool. or use any stream cipher. All stream ciphers work like this. And the way all of these systems work is you take the key and you do some operations on the key, and that outputs a series of bytes called the pad. And then you just take the clear text message and you XOR it with the pad, and that's the ciphertext. And to decrypt, you just take the same key, you generate the same sequence of bytes, you XOR that again, and the pads cancel out, and you get the clear text. Right? So the benefit to the person who's trying to modify a message is to change the transcript. All you have to do is flip some bits of the ciphertext. And if you flip a bit of a ciphertext in one of these systems, all it does is flip that exact bit of the plaintext. And there's no other change. So this is as easy as it gets if you can't read the message. In addition, if you know part of the message because of known message structure, headers, whatever, it's certainly trivial to change that part. Right? You can make that part say whatever you want. But wait, what about the Mac, right? If you're Eve, so if you know some structure to the message or anything like that, then flipping individual bits will flip the corresponding bits of the output. And it's much easier to do that than it is if you have some strong, non-malleable encryption where flipping one bit causes the entire message to garble. Oh, you're not randomly flipping bits, you're flipping bits with a purpose, right? So let's say the message contains a dollar amount, right? And you know in the structure of the message that where the dollar amount is, then you could flip bits there and change the dollar amount. Or if it contains an account number, right? If I know that Alice is paying Bob some amount and there's an account number field, I can flip it and cause it to pay to someone else.
Do you know what number you would be flipping into?
You would if you knew what the original number was. You might not know the entire message, but you might know the amount, or you might know a piece, or it might be enough just to change it to some higher number, right? Like I might not know what, say I get you to pay me $1, and in the wire transfer message, I flip the 2 to the 31 bit in the message, right? Then suddenly you're paying me a lot of money, even though I don't know what most of the message is. Okay, so what about this Mac we're using? Any change Eve makes the transcript is going to cause the Mac to fail, right? And she'll be detected. So how does she get away with changing it? So we need Eve to be able to calculate the correct Mac tag, right? We need the transcript to be able to be alterable with the right Mac. Wait, what are you, nuts? The whole point of the Mac is that Bob can be assured that Alice is the one who sent the message and that it hasn't been modified. But in order for Eve to calculate the correct Mac, she needs the Mac key for the message, and then she can forge messages. So wait, but here's the key idea. Bob only needs to be assured of the authenticity of the message at the time he receives it. Once he's received the message and understands that and is assured of the fact that Alice is the one that sent it, doesn't matter if Eve can modify the transcript and change the Mac. So we publish the Mac keys. Okay? Remember that the Mac key is the hash of the encryption key, and the encryption key changes regularly, roughly every message. So this means the Mac key also changes roughly every message. So once Bob changes the Mac key and forgets the corresponding encryption key, he publishes the Mac key by including it just in the header of the next message he sends out, right? So he was assured at the time Alice sent the message that the message was accurate. But as soon as he sends his next message out, and the Mac key is in it, anyone in the world can change that previous message and recalculate the Mac correctly. What's that? Anyone that's watching the internet. Yeah. Right. And this Mac key isn't part of the encrypted or authenticated message. It's just tacked onto the front. And Yeah, so shortly after Bob receives a message from Alice, he's trivially able to alter the transcript as well. So, just quickly putting it together, we combine these techniques, perfect forward secrecy, message authentication codes, malleable encryption, to produce what we call the off-the-record messaging protocol. We have a simple implementation of this protocol. As a library, it just basically takes text messages in and produces encrypted ASCII armored text out, which we've hooked into the game instant message client. The GUI really sucks, but if someone is good at GUIs, come talk to me or Nikita. Nikita will be here during DEF CON. So conclusions. Traditional public key cryptography like PGP works great when nothing goes wrong. But keys can be stolen, person you're talking to could be a snitch. Things go wrong all the time. We really have to use other techniques to mitigate the harm of a compromise. Techniques, perfect forward secrecy, repudiability. More information, this URL right now, there's a preprint of a paper up there. The source code isn't up there yet, but will be shortly, hopefully after we get some prettier GUI in it. That's it. Any questions? Yeah. I'm sorry? Oh. So the question is, how do you ensure the key is forgotten? The answer is, it's pretty hard. Make sure it never touches disk, right? You never ever want this key to touch disk or swap or anything like this, right? So most OSs have some mlock-like command. Some OSs it doesn't work, but whatever. This is an engineering problem. I'm going to punt this problem to the engineers. Yeah, it's not that tough. There is an issue of, well, what about those people who say that if I steal your computer and dunk it in liquid nitrogen, I can read out the information that was in RAM? I mean, at some point, you've got to give up, right? But, yeah. So the question is there a vulnerability regarding the bootstrap? And the bootstrap is just your standard signed Diffie-Hellman. It's a extremely well understood protocol. No, if the question is if Carl owns you at the moment of bootstrap, will he be able to do anything special? If he can trick your computer into telling you that these messages are coming from Alice when they're not, I mean, as long as he's owning your computer, then he can make your computer say anything he wants. Right? He can make your computer say that Bill Clinton sent George W. Bush a message saying, I love you and want to be your slave, right? But it's not true, at least as far as I know. Okay, it seems we're out of time. Thank you very much.